How likely is China to start a war? This may be the single most important question in global affairs today. If China uses military force against Taiwan or any other country with which it has a territorial dispute, it could lead to a full-blown war in the Asia-Pacific. A fight between two nuclear-armed giants, China and the United States, both of whom are brawling for hegemony in a region that is fraught with tensions. That is the last thing the world needs right now. If China attacked Taiwan amid the ongoing wars in Ukraine, as well as the one in Gaza, the world would be consumed by multiple wars. Something we have not seen since the end of the Second World War in 1945. On Crux Decode, is China preparing for war? And if it is, then what should the world do? There's been a recent flurry of high-level diplomacy between Washington and Beijing, but that is not stopping China. Under Chinese President Xi Jinping, Beijing is amassing ships, planes, and missiles as part of the largest military buildup by any country in decades. China is stockpiling fuel and food and trying to reduce the vulnerability of its economy to sanctions. These are classic steps that a country would take if it fears a conflict. Xi Jinping has said that China must prepare for worst-case scenarios and be ready to withstand high winds and choppy waters, even dangerous storms. Now, all of this comes as Beijing has become increasingly aggressive in its dealings with its neighbors with whom it has a territorial dispute. That includes the Philippines, Japan, and India. China has also periodically threatened to invade Taiwan. Many American officials believe that the risk of war is rising. CIA Director William Burns has said that Xi Jinping is seeking the capability to take Taiwan by 2027. That is the year the Chinese People's Liberation Army finishes 100 years. Also that he would want to get this done before the end of his tenure in 2028 as the Great Reunification, the last remaining unfinished business in the modern-day People's Republic. And as China's economy struggles, some observers are also looking for signs that a peaking China might turn aggressive in order to distract from its internal problems. Not everyone agrees, though. Other analysts think that the risk of Chinese aggression is overblown. Some scholars say the danger can be managed provided Washington does not provoke Beijing. There is a long-standing argument that China will not upend a status quo which has served it well for the last 40 years. Others also point out to the fact that China has not started a war since its invasion of Vietnam back in 1979. Still others dismiss the prospect that China might fight in response to a slowing economy or other domestic problems, claiming that the country has got no history of diversionary war. Now, what links all of these arguments is a basic belief in continuity of Chinese conduct. The idea that a country which has not launched a war in the last 40 years is unlikely to do so now. Political scientists and historians have identified a range of factors that make great powers more inclined to fight. When one considers 4 factors, it becomes very clear that many of the conditions that once enabled the peaceful rise of China may now be encouraging a violent descent. If you look at it historically, the first factor is territorial disputes. China is contesting these with many countries, both in the East and South China Seas, and increasingly it is becoming less and less susceptible to compromise or some kind of peaceful resolution. That makes China's foreign policy a zero-sum game. The second factor is the military balance in Asia, which is shifting in ways that could make Beijing perilously optimistic about the outcome of war. Third, as China's short-term military prospects improve, its long-term strategic and economic outlook is darkening, a combination that has often made revisionist powers more violent in the past. And fourth, Xi Jinping has turned China into some kind of a personalized dictatorship which is particularly prone to disastrous miscalculations which could lead to costly wars. Now, the possibility of a US-China war might seem remote at first glance. Beijing, like I said before, has not fought a war in 44 years, and its military has not killed large numbers of foreigners since 1988, when Chinese frigates gunned down 60-odd Vietnamese sailors in a skirmish that happened around the Spratly Islands. The so-called Asian peace over the last 40 years or so, that is, no major war has broken out in East Asia since 1979, it has fundamentally rested on Chinese peace. The absence of war, though, has hardly meant the absence of aggression. Beijing has used military and paramilitary techniques to press aggressive claims in the South and East China Seas. In recent years, China has also engaged in bloody scraps on the land border with India. It would not be the first time that a seemingly peaceful rising power went rogue. Prior to 1914, Germany had not fought a single major war for more than 40 years. Then World War I happened. In the 1920s, Japan looked like a responsible stakeholder. It signed peace treaties, it pledged to limit its navy, sharing power in Asia, respecting other countries and their territorial integrity. Japan, of course, went on to become an active player in World War II. In the early 2000s, Russian President Vladimir Putin mused about joining NATO. He wanted the West and Russia to come closer. That each of these three countries, Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, and now modern-day Russia, have all gone on to launch barbaric wars of conquest underscores a simple truth: that things change. The same country can behave differently depending on changed circumstances. Now, here's one big factor. Roughly 85% of all international conflicts waged since 1945 have revolved around territorial claims. Now, territory is hard to share because it often has symbolic or even strategic value. Even when nations agree to divide an area, they often end up fighting over the most valuable parts. Look at India and Pakistan in the context of Kashmir. There are valuable regions, whether it is cities, oil reserves, holy sites, waterways, even strategic high ground, which countries are loath to give to the other side. Territorial disputes are particularly likely to escalate when one side fears that its claims are getting eroded or that the other side is simply not respecting its claims. A second cause of war is shifting military balance. Wars are waged over various issues, but they all share a fundamental cause, and that is false optimism. They happen when both sides believe they can use force to achieve their objectives. In other words, when both sides think that they can win. But here's the rub: most wars have only one winner. Third, great powers become belligerent when they fear strategic decline. Geopolitical competition is fierce, it's oftentimes unforgiving. No nation wants to give up on its strategic importance, its relative wealth, its standing amongst the Committee of Nations, or even hard military power. Even the mightiest countries can spiral into violent insecurity when they are beset either by economic stagnation or by strategic encirclement. For Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, and of course Putin's Russia, it was about fighting geopolitical irrelevance. It was about reducing strategic decline. And finally, a country's conduct is shaped by who is ruling there. Personalist dictatorships are more than twice as likely to start wars as democracies are, in which power is held not by one or a few stakeholders, but by many. Dictators initiate more wars because they are less exposed to the flip side of war or the cost of losing power as a consequence of conflict. Over the last 100 years, dictators who lost wars fell from power only 30% of the time, which means there is a 2 in 3 chance that a dictator, even if he were to preside over a losing war, will not end up losing power. Whereas democratic leaders who lost wars were almost always voted out of power or simply removed from office almost 100% of the time. That is a consequence that Xi Jinping does not have to worry about. If you were to take these 4 red signals from Beijing, it is clear that these red signals are blinking harder with each passing day. And the international community can only afford to ignore these red signals at its own peril.